So today I'm going to be talking about the 4 basic modes of a camera, as well as the variables that go into determining what variables you should set for your photo. So starting off with the 4 basic modes of your camera, I'm going to go over them real quick. They are represented by P, which stands for program mode, A, which stands for aperture priority mode, S, which stands for shutter priority mode, and M for manual. So sometimes you'll see AB or ST depending on your camera for aperture and shutter speed. But basically, program mode is when your camera will pick the aperture and shutter speed for you. So you don't really have to do anything about that. And the manual mode is for when you want to set both the aperture and the shutter speed. And these 2 modes in between, aperture is when you, as the photographer, you set the aperture mode, and the camera will pick a good shutter speed that goes along with it, and vice versa for shutter speed. So now I'm going to cover a bit more in depth what aperture, shutter speed, and a third variable called ISO will do to your photograph. So starting with aperture. Aperture, usually most people think about it as a variable that controls the depth of field in your photo. And what that means is if you have a photo, sometimes you'll want the background to be blurry, you want to focus on a person or some subject in the foreground, you will use aperture to control that. Or if you want the foreground to be blurry but you want to focus on the background, you can use aperture to control that as well. And how that works is aperture, you'll usually see it represented by an f-stop number, such as f of 2.0 or f of 16.0, something like this. And how it works is aperture is the inverse relationship between how wide your lens is open and the focal length. So just basically, if your lens is wider, it's a bigger circle, so in the same amount of time, you can let in more light, which means that your photo will be brighter. This bigger aperture also means that you're focusing more on the foreground. So if you want a foreground focused picture like this one, you will want a smaller f-stop number and a bigger aperture circle. So these numbers and the actual size are inverse related. So the smaller the number, the bigger the circle, and the bigger the number, this number right here, the smaller the circle, the aperture lens circle. So now that was a quick overview of what aperture does. Shutter speed, as it sounds, controls how fast the shutter closes on your camera. As we covered in lecture, there are multiple different shutters out there. There's a leaf shutter, where the shutter kind of like is circular and closes in a leaf kind of pattern, or a focal plane shutter, which is just a slider that goes across the shutter. And this is usually represented by a number that tells the time that the shutter is open for. So a number like 1/1000 is a very fast shutter speed. It's used for quick motion. So usually if you want a photo to be less blurry, you want to capture some quick motion, you will need to use a fast shutter speed to capture that. Whereas if you want a longer exposure time, you might use a slower shutter speed. There's like 1 second, 2 seconds, even slower. So your shutter will just be open for longer. And finally, ISO stands for the International Standards Organization. It dictates how sensitive your lens is to light. So ISO is usually controls how noisy your photo is. So usually you don't want a high ISO number because the higher the number, so it ranges from like 100 to 6400, but the higher the number, the more noisy your photo will look, and usually you don't want this if you have enough light. So it's best just to keep it as low as possible. And yeah. Any questions?